So the music is gone. I'm back. I'm flexible. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying, that we have today a fantastic discussion. We'll talk about how to finance adaptation, how to mobilize private capital, to increase our capacity to develop and to be more resilient. And to do so, we have an incredible audience, but we have an amazing panel with a lot of great panel members, So I will call my panelists, on the stage. So I will start first, gentlemen, if you agree, with the lady, for sure. I will introduce Franziska Hollmann. She's a director for private sector at DEG. DEG is the subsidiary of KfW, the German bank. And you are totally dedicated to the private sector, totally dedicated to climate. And I will invite you, let's say, on the stage. Thank you so much. So my second panel member will be Sergio Pimenta. He is the vice president of IFC. Thank you so much, Sergio, to be with us. Sergio is an outstanding fellow. He's an engineer. He's a banker, and is managing a portfolio of $30 billion, dollars in Africa. So thank you to be here, and it will be a great discussion. Next panel member will be Samalia Zubaru. You are the president of IFC. Thank you to be here. It's a great pleasure and great honor to have you. We can have big hands for this gentleman. And now we have Patrick Van Kuren. You are the Global Climate for Adaptation Center. It's a center of excellence. We can have big hands. He's one of our expertise center, in adaptation at global level. Thank you, Patrick, to be here. For this panel, we have two additional speakers. We have Dr. Sidi Hood Hatta. I guess, gentlemen, you are the Director General of the Arabic Bank, of Development for Africa. And we are very honored to have you with us. So maybe you can take a seat. Thank you so much to be here with us. And just on time, President. This is a privilege to be President, to be just on time. We have the privilege to have the President of the BOAD, Mr. Serge Ekwe, and Mr. President, I invite you to take a seat. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying, we have an outstanding panel with outstanding panelists. What we'll be talking about, it's about adaptation. I will ask our panel members, to present their institution vision, strategy to mobilize private capital and to address the massive needs, to invest in adaptation. We will bring some example in three domains that are agriculture, resilience infrastructure, and biodiversity. Two different profile, let's say, very different profile, of investment and level of risk, level of bankability, level of profitability. But before starting, I will ask to our expert, Mrs. Chimdi Ondiegu, to join the scene, to be a sort of keynote speaker, to set up the scene with macro perspective, and if you would like to join the scene and to be at the lecture, so you can introduce, this debate. So thank you so much to be here. Let's start this debate. Let's make it, let's say, if possible, to bring out of the box, solutions and to make it lively. I don't want to make something, everybody talk after the other, but we'd like really to have a real discussion between the different panelists. So, Chimdi, floor is yours.
Great.
Set up the scene, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Setting the scene. So, based off the topic we're here to discuss today, we're talking about climate financing in Africa. And as you can see, a lot of the climate financing comes from the public sector right now. So we're seeing a dearth in private sector financing in the continent. 57% of this comes from development finance institutions. And most of this tend to come through grants and concessional debt. So there's also a lack of variability in the types of instruments being used on the continent to finance the climate sector. 80% from the private sector tends to come from commercial financial institutions and corporations. Now, key for us here is if we're saying 88% of the financing is for public sector, we need to have instruments that the private sector would feel comfortable investing in the sector, so we need to have de-risking instruments such as first loss guarantees. Adaptation investment stays unmet. So as you can see from the graph, most of investment goes to energy and then to mitigation. So a lot of the investment right now in the continent is going through to mitigation and not to adaptation. Now, we need adaptation investments between $259 to $407 billion. And when you contrast that with the amount we're receiving right now, it shows you how big a gap that we have right now on the continent. We have currently estimated annual cost of climate action to be about $18 billion annually, and we need about 26 to 41 billion for adaptation and 72 billion for mitigation. Given all of this, it's important for us to diversify sources of climate finance. So we can see from here that across all the different sources, whether that's the multilateral development banks, the non-DAC members and other multilaterals, most of the financing is through grants and debts. Now, there's a risk because if we continue to collect the funds based off debts, we can potentially worsen the debt situation of the African countries. And so we need to find ways to improve and have more things like equity, mezzanine instruments, bringing in funds to finance climate in the continent. Generally, we've seen 6 anchors for climate finance mobilization, and I'll talk through what you can see on the screen right now. For strategic partnerships, one of the gaps we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are working in silos, so they're working on their own to do the same thing other organizations are doing. How do we ensure that companies, organizations are partnering together to address the climate issues we face on the continent? In terms of capacity building and awareness, a lot of private organizations do not have the capacity for adaptation, and plenty times mitigation is the first resort, just given the understanding of the sector. Innovation and technology. There are some companies that have started bringing in new technology into the space that is able to get to the end users and able to help, but we still have a long way to go. So how do we begin to innovate and begin to use the right technology to ensure that we're adapting sufficiently? For finance mobilization, as you've seen on the previous slides, it's very difficult right now for us to grow, whether the mitigation, adaptation, and even for the other things that we need to do. So how do we begin to mobilize finance from the private sector, and even from the public sector? How do we begin to change the kind of, or expand the kind of instruments that are being used to finance climate issues on the continent? Strategic policies and regulatory frameworks. A lot of African countries have started putting in place policies, but we still have a long way to go in terms of having the right policies in place that would actually enable countries, organizations within those countries to finance the kind of issues. A lot of that would only come by working together across the continent, actually, not just country by country, to ensure that we have the right regulatory frameworks that are tailored to the African context and not just borrowed from other contexts. And then finally, institutions coordination. Almost similar to strategic partnerships, how do we ensure that everything is coordinated, things are not being fragmented? Because right now, there's a lot of fragmentation in the space. Finally, to the topic we're here to speak about, we see that unlocking private sector investment is key to diversify and increase climate finance flows. Now, we've seen that engagement drivers in the space are through 4 main things, and we've started talking through some of this. One is knowledge and awareness. The second is innovation. The third is coordination. And the fourth is monitoring and reporting. Across all of this, it's essential for us to build capacity building, to build capacity for the local institutions and also the regional institutions. Secondly, we need to de-risk efforts. Once again, remember the first slide where we could see that 88% of climate financing was coming from the public sector. So how do we ensure that the private sector is playing a role by de-risking the efforts to invest in the private sector and country-based financial institutions? Thirdly, we need to begin to scale up and replicate existing MSME green investment funds and solutions. So some of those have started happening as pilots and in small pockets across the continent. But we need to go from the pilot phase to scaling up and ensuring that MSMEs have access to green investment funds, because they are the drivers of the economy in plenty African countries, and we can't leave them behind on the climate journey. Finally, how do we strengthen monitoring and evaluation to ensure that we can assess investments and initiatives, and we make sure that their impact is right on target? So some of the things we've seen is that even when solutions are in place, we're not monitoring if these solutions are working the way they're set out to work or if they're not. And so we need to start setting up M&E institutions and M&E database processes to ensure that we can actually assess the investments that are being made. Thank you.
MD, I think we can have begins to thank this lady. Thank you so much. It's very clear. So my first question goes directly to Mr. Pimenta, Sergio Pimenta from IFC. Sergio, challenge is huge. We are talking about 70 billion, going to mitigation, and only 30 billion, going to adaptation. How can we rebalance, let's say, those economics? How we can, let's say, increase the level of funding for adaptation, by mobilizing private capital for adaptation?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I think Shimdi really set the stage and gave us all the numbers that really make us think of what needs to be done in order to finance adaptation. And what is very clear from those numbers, and I think every assessment that is done coincides very much with those numbers, however you can challenge this or that one, is that one, there's a lot of funding going on the public sector, but not enough on the private sector. And second, you've got a lot of fund going for mitigation and not enough for adaptation. So we all need, and I mean, IFC, as the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, we are very keen on focusing exactly on that piece that is missing, which is how we help private sector play a bigger role in the fight against climate change, and in particular adaptation. And we're not just doing this because it's important for private sector, but it's also important for governments that today, I mean, we all know the fiscal situation of all the countries, not just in Africa. There's no more room to do what is needed in terms of investing for fighting climate change. So we do need private sector to step up. So I think there's a few ideas that we need to pursue. I mean, the first one is that there's this notion that investments in adaptation might not be profitable or might be too risky and so on. I think we have to demonstrate in a very clear way that many of these interventions actually make economic sense, not just good for the environment, good for the planet, but also good for the companies that are doing it. And this is one of the things that we've been doing at IFC, is we've been really rolling out a certain number of projects in different sectors, in agriculture, in infrastructure, in water, and so on, where we show that investing in adaptation makes sense also economically. The second part is that once you've done that, you realize that and this is a theme that comes quite often in Africa, is that, well, we need to make sure that these projects are bankable and there are enough of them and so on. And very often, risk or perception of risk makes it too expensive or not too expensive to be done on a purely commercial basis. So what we need to do then is not shift to okay, it's too expensive for commercial debt, so let's go into a public model. I mean, we can develop sort of hybrid models where we de-risk the project with some public funding, and with that, with a minimal level of subsidy, you can actually maximize the impact that you have, because you can do larger projects and leverage funding from private sector. Many companies, and I mean, we had the Africa CEO Forum, and I know many of you in the room and many of the participants all believe that this is something that we need to do. We just need to get the models, show that they work, and then replicate them so that we have, at scale, impact on adaptation in Africa.
No, thank you very much. So, but de-risking, or let's say making bankable, is it something that we can always do? Samaria, because I mean you are, I mean with AFC advising and supporting with technical assistance, you know, investors to try to make bankable those projects. Is it always possible? Because when we talk, for example, about agriculture sector, we can bring technologies, we can bring practice, we can bring, let's say, new technicality, let's say, to improve the productivity, you know, of agriculture. But when we talk, for example, about, you know, biodiversity or other topic, is it always possible to make it to make bankable this kind of project?
Good evening.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
It could be evening.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the comments that were made by Chimdi and Sergio. Certainly, it is possible to de-risk opportunities. It's actually one of our key focus areas at the Africa Finance Corporation. We were set up to address Africa's infrastructure deficit, and from when we started, we realized that there's a big gap between the investment need and actual projects that can be financed. So our focus was, let's contribute to de-risking the opportunities and transforming them to bankable projects. And we do that through a number of ways. The first is to look at what is important and what can move the dial in a particular sector, economy, or country, and then try to focus on the best way for us to do that. So we started by first trying to see how we could replace imported fuels in economies. So most African countries are using imported fuels, either diesel or fuel oil, as energy sources, which is very expensive and has significant impact on climate. So we are for how can we use naturally available resources, you know, as feedstock for energy. So one of the first projects we did was the wind farm in Cape Verde, which really utilized their resources. We're working on a project here in Côte d'Ivoire, where we're looking at a hydro dam that will reduce the cost of the energy mix in the country, because with hydro it's typically cheaper. We're looking at a wind farm as well in Djibouti, also to replace imported fuels. For us, imported fuels, you know, is actually one of the key contributors to carbon emissions, because ocean emissions really is the 6th largest carbon emitter. You know, after, you know, China, US, India, Russia, Japan, ocean voyages are the largest emitters. And for us, as Africans, tackling and reducing ocean emissions is one of the key tools that Africa contribute towards the whole conversations on climate. So we definitely do the risk, and we do that by investing our own capital, and then crowding in capital from partners. So for example, we do a lot of work with DEG in that space, where we have worked with them to de-risk opportunities. And it's something that we continue to do. But going forward, since we're discussing climate, you know, we think that the big challenge is that there's not enough capital coming into Africa. And that needs to change, because there is really no allocation for Africa. You know, and that also needs to be looked at. You know, how can we convert all the pledges that have been made into tangible investments? We think that one way to do that, you know, is through blended finance, you know, which Sergio also mentioned, and Chimdi also mentioned that as part of the tools into looking at first loss capital. We have looked at and created an infrastructure climate resilient fund that is focused on blended finance, which is we will look at getting that initial first loss and then loading commercial capital on top of that. That is one way of directing capital flows into Africa. We also think that insurance is a good tool for directing flows to Africa. And there again, what we think will be useful is to work with reality as opposed to perception, because the amount of non-payment insurance or political risk insurance that is paid in Africa is very limited, but it's not reflected in the premiums that are charged. So we think that there needs to be a balance between, you know, the reality and the perception of risk, so that the premiums can come down, and then you can have a lot more insurance tools used at scale to mobilize capital into Africa. I hope I have another chance to say more. I don't want to.
No, for sure. Thank you so much, Emilia. I think it's more than crucial what you said. It's a blended finance model, what you mentioned, Sergio, as well. But it's an hybrid model combining adaptation and mitigation as well. And both of them, let's say, can generate a sort of bankability, of those projects. This is absolutely true. But you mentioned both of you blended finance. I'm turning now to the president of BOAD, Mr. Ekwe. Mr. Ekwe, I will speak in French. This is what I guess that you are expecting from me, correct?
That's what I've been told.
OK. Je peux parler français, donc pas de problème, bien sûr. Vous êtes le président de la BOAD qui représente les États d'Afrique de l'Ouest. Et votre rôle, c'est à la fois d'accroître la mobilisation financière publique en faveur du développement des pays d'Afrique de l'Ouest, mais également de faire un effet de levier sur le secteur privé. Exactement ce qui vient d'être soulevé par les deux précédents panélistes. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire comment la BOAD, à l'échelle de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, bien entendu, comment cette mobilisation se fait et quels sont les effets de levier que vous utilisez pour pouvoir mobiliser le secteur privé sur des projets qui ne sont pas forcément bancables ou à haut risque? Merci.
Thank you. Thank you. The idea. I have to speak in French. Pardon. Oui, d'accord. Bon, alors non, mais merci pour ce mot introductif. Alors, à la BOAD, comment est-ce qu'on traite le sujet? D'accord, sur le constat entre l'atténuation et l'adaptation, c'est vrai. Mais en fait, quand on regarde, on considère qu'il ne devrait pas y avoir qu'un seul critère d'appréciation qui soit la rentabilité financière. Parce qu'au-delà de la rentabilité financière, vous avez également la rentabilité économique des projets qui participent à la qualité de l'actif. On est très attaché, je vais en dire deux mots, à la façon avec laquelle on traite le passif du bilan, mais ce qui nous importe également, c'est la qualité de l'actif. Qu'est-ce qu'on met en face des ressources que l'on utilise? Le deuxième point, ce sont les externalités positives, notamment en matière environnementale et sociale. Donc ce sont des critères que nous utilisons, que ce soit dans les phases d'instruction de nos dossiers, mais également dans le dialogue que nous avons avec les investisseurs. La réalité, c'est que les investisseurs, aujourd'hui, alors j'ai toujours l'habitude de rappeler que les poches des investisseurs n'ont jamais été, en tout cas avant la crise en Ukraine, n'ont jamais été aussi profondes. Vous prenez un investisseur comme BlackRock. BlackRock, c'était, avant la crise, c'était près de 10 000 milliards. Donc 10 trillions de dollars, c'est à peu près la moitié du PIB des États-Unis. Donc on est dans un monde, en fait, on est clairement dans un autre monde. Alors, ces investisseurs sont prêts à nous écouter, y compris sur les sujets d'adaptation, pour autant qu'on soit capable d'apporter quelques critères. Un des premiers critères, c'est est-ce que l'investissement est fléchable? Est-ce que l'on peut le tracer? Le deuxième point, quels sont les KPI que l'on y met? Comment est-ce que l'on valorise l'impact? Parce qu'aujourd'hui, vous savez, il y a des métriques qui permettent de manière très précise, très scientifique, de savoir quels sont les impacts de tel ou tel modèle. Donc aujourd'hui, même dans les term sheets des fonds, il existe des critères qui vont dans ce sens. Alors après, effectivement, il y a tout le sujet du greenwashing et tout ceci a tempéré un peu l'engouement des investisseurs. Mais la réalité est que quand vous faites quand vous êtes capable de démontrer que vous avez un actif dont le financement est fléché, avec des KPI très précis et les impacts, vous pouvez y arriver. Alors, il y a un effet volume. Vous prenez par exemple le cas de la BOAD. Nous avons investi, avant qu'on arrive, un peu moins de 400 millions de dollars sur les sujets green et climat, dans cette partie d'adaptation, sur la base du plan stratégique que nous mettons en place, 2021-2025, le plan Joliba, nous passons à 1,4 milliard de dollars qui est substantielle, mais qui correspond dans le fond à l'ADN d'une maison comme la nôtre, qui est une maison de développement. Donc, ce qui nous intéresse, c'est pas tellement le bottom line, même si, bon, en tant que président, je dois m'assurer que la maison est rentable et que les actifs de la maison sont bien gérés, que le bilan de la banque est bien géré. Mais ce qui nous importe avant tout, c'est notre capacité à réaliser de l'impact là où les gens n'y vont pas forcément. Vous voyez? Et on est un peu, non pas découvreurs d'avenir, mais on est un peu des découvreurs. On doit montrer la voie dans un certain nombre de secteurs qui ne sont pas a priori les plus rentables. Juste un dernier mot, on lève 750 millions de dollars l'année dernière, il y a un an et demi, à un taux jamais atteint, taux concessionnel, puisque je rappelle que la ressource concessionnelle est très rare, mais c'est cette ressource concessionnelle qui est utilisée précisément sur ces projets. Voilà en quelques mots ce que je pourrais dire dans un propos liminaire. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's true. You know, when you discuss with financial institutions and pension funds today or private equity, it's true that because of, let's say, the financial disclosure, they have to explain what is the impact, you know, of the capital they are managing, you know. And this is, let's say, a strong opportunity for us, let's say, to help those funds, those private equity or this capital, let's say, to invest in the right direction, to maximize the impact of, you know, this capital. That's true. To maximize the capital, I mean, we have around the table as well, you know, as I said, we have Patrick van Hohen. He's the Director General, you know, of the Global Center for Adaptation. Patrick, I mean, you are a center of expertise, you know, at global level for adaptation. How can you help to define those metrics, you know, to determine, let's say, some best practice, to instill confidence and trust, you know, with investors, just to make them confident and comfortable to invest, you know, in adaptation project in Africa?
Well, thank you so much, Patrice. And actually, I would like to go back to Sergio's point about economic imperative to invest in climate adaptation. And also, Shimdi, I mean, your numbers were phenomenal. I mean, the reality is here. How much needs to be invested annually in climate adaptation? The numbers are there, 33 billion. How much is flowing now from north to south? 6 billion, i.e. delta, 27 billion. That 27 billion cannot come from public finance. I think that was your central point, one of your first points, Sergio. But let's not forget, in Glasgow, government leaders committed to double adaptation finance.
That's right.
But even if they were to double, there's still this massive delta which needs to be filled by someone else. So what has happened in the last year? And you asked in the beginning, Patrice, in your framing, what's the plan? What's the strategy? Not of the GCA, not of the IFC, not of the banks here, for Africa. Well, in fact, African leaders put a plan on the table. What was it? The Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. $25 billion over 5 years put on the table in Glasgow, half of which is already on the table, right? So $12.5 billion is there, $12.5 billion is missing. That's the big Africa play. What is it? 4 things. 1, according to your topics, investing in food security. Building again on Sergio's point, the cost of investing in climate smart agriculture, how much is on an annual basis? $15 billion. But the cost of inaction, not investing in climate smart agriculture, $200 billion. So there is even a ratio 1 to 10. So it's a smart economic thing to do. Second pillar, resilient infrastructure. According to World Bank figures, it does make economic sense to invest in infrastructure. Why? Upfront cost, additional 3%. Return on investment, 1 to 4. So this economic argument is very, very compelling. 3 foundational pieces. 1 is access to finance, right? If you are an enterprise or even a government in Africa, how do you access the Green Climate Fund? How do you access the Adaptation Fund? Why is that funding not flowing to Africa? 1, the procedures are extremely difficult. The project pipeline is not there. So that's a foundational piece. The point I'm trying to bring here is we can talk about blended finance, about mainstreaming and incorporating risk into decision making. If the data is not there, if the climate data as a foundational piece is not there, it's very difficult to move on the adaptation agenda. So I think as a central piece for sort of private sector engagement and private sector finance, it's very important to invest in climate data, weather-related data. You can't manage, Patrice, what you can't measure.
No, that's true. And reliable data, of course, you know, accuracy. This is what is important. Oh, interesting. You said mobilizing access to capital is key and mobilizing capital is key, you know. Oh, Francesca, you are, German bank, focus on private sector for developing countries. How can we mobilize capital?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, I would like to encourage CEOs, because this is a CEO forum here.
Exactly.
And so I think many CEOs are in this room. And I would like to encourage CEOs to think about climate investment. It's a business model, and it's really the best mitigation and adaptation and also building resilience if the companies who emit with their production, or who run the risk of being exposed to climate risk, if they invest. And DG is advising its clients all over the world for more than 10 years now in different aspects related to climate, and we are really happy to see that now it's getting a huge push through this climate debate, that companies are encouraged to think about business model. So first is just some examples. First is prevention. I mean, there are physical risks for all agri companies. There's flooding, there's drought. There are measures to reduce this risk and to mitigate. You can invest and investigate in technologies, in construction of your fields, of your business, being a bit more resilient against this risk. Second, adaptation. We are talking about climate adaptation. And here we all know there's a lot of investigation on varieties. A client of ours, they cooperate with a university. Another client, they even build their own institute, and they constantly improve and develop new varieties and measures to improve the soils. It's a business model, because if they don't do it, then they will lose money, and if they do it, then they will have a good chance to be or to maintain a leader in the market, adapted to the climate risk. Third, building back better. This is a wonderful catchword, but I think what it tells me is thinking about the natural resources. How did our ancestors do agri? So what can we use, and can we maybe work with biochar and crop rotation and very traditional, very, very simple things, but just remember that agri doesn't have to be the way we are doing it. Well, and then of course, also in agribusiness and food production, greenhouse gas emissions, we need to avoid it. So investment in energy and resource efficiency avoids the emission, and at the same time it saves cost. So in the long run, it makes a lot of sense to invest. And last point, last but not least, without water, there is no food and beverage. And we have to take care of water, of the water availability, to be water efficient and to reuse the water and try to be very, very responsible with the water resources. So again, we are advising our clients how can they do it, what is water efficiency checks, and are member of the Water Stewardship Alliance. So I think these are the 5 aspects we are focusing on, encouraging private sector.
Oh, thank you, Francesca. So it means that your company has decided to develop a sort of advisory services to improve the bankability of the project, to support investors, private investors, or let's say on the project owner side as well, how to improve, let's say the economics of a project to make it bankable. This is what you did.
Absolutely, and I mean, it's not only about advising; it's also de-risking. So, because for de-risking, you don't need necessarily guarantees or public funds. You can also de-risk in your own business model.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. Patrick, you mentioned that we have a plan. At the COP, we decided about the AAA action plan, to finance, adaptation in Africa. So, Doctor, you are representing, let's say, the Arabian Bank, of Development for Africa, Okay. Can you hear me now? Much better? Thank you. So, you are representing the Arabic Bank of Development. We have a plan, a large adaptation plan, that Patrick mentioned, that was decided in Glasgow. Are you ready to invest? Are you ready to mobilize capital to invest for this plan? Are you aware about this plan? You have a mic on your side. No, on your side. Take this one.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, comme Serge, je
On
vais
peut
pas
parler
aussi en
français. On
français.
peut parler français.
Donc, en fait, nous étions partie prenante à Glasgow. Donc, la BADEA était présente, on avait notre stand à Glasgow et donc nous sommes tout à fait engagés comme les autres sur ce terrain. Ce que je veux dire par rapport à cette question, donc, on a vu effectivement qu'il y a plus de financement pour l'atténuation que pour l'adaptation, mais aussi qu'on a besoin d'attirer plus de financement du secteur privé. Mais en fait, pour attirer ce financement du secteur privé, nous avons besoin aussi d'atténuer les risques. Et donc, c'est pourquoi je pense que la valeur ajoutée de la Banque arabe pour le développement économique en Afrique, BADEA, c'est surtout son rôle de catalyseur des financements arabes. Donc, d'abord, dans le cadre des financements concessionnels et des dons, donc la banque, non seulement sur ses ressources propres, mais aussi en partenariat avec ce qu'on appelle le groupe de coordination arabe, donc le Fonds saoudien de développement, le Fonds koweïtien de développement, le Fonds d'Abu Dhabi, le Fonds du Qatar et le Fonds de l'OPEP. Donc, nous travaillons ensemble pour mobiliser davantage de ressources pour contribuer à mettre à la disposition des pays africains des ressources concessionnelles et des dons. Ceci pour le côté aide publique au développement. Maintenant, le plus important, c'est d'attirer plus de financement du secteur privé. Et là, je pense qu'au niveau de nos actionnaires principaux, donc je pense aux fonds souverains des pays du Golfe, donc nous avons aussi la possibilité d'attirer ces financements, d'attirer des investisseurs du Golfe pour venir investir en Afrique dans des projets d'adaptation.
Et quels sont les critères, quelles sont les contraintes que ces fonds souverains du Golfe vous demandent pour pouvoir investir dans des projets d'adaptation en Afrique?
Bien sûr, c'est ce que nous allons régler à travers des financements concessionnels et des dons. Voilà, donc c'est une combinaison en fait de ressources concessionnelles, de dons, mais aussi d'investissements secteur privé, avec une mentalité secteur privé. Donc, à travers les financements concessionnels que nous avons et les dons, nous pouvons permettre d'élever toutes les difficultés qui peuvent être rencontrées par les investisseurs privés. Qu'il s'agisse d'abord d'aider les pays à mettre en place les politiques et les réglementations nécessaires pour rendre attractif le climat des investissements dans les pays, mais aussi les réglementations relatives à l'adaptation et ensuite aussi éventuellement financer des campagnes de sensibilisation auprès des populations en partenariat avec la société civile pour créer un environnement et une compréhension partagée par les populations donc des enjeux de l'adaptation. Ce qui facilite bien sûr le terrain pour les investissements. On peut aussi financer les études nécessaires pour permettre d'avoir des études bancables, comme vient de le dire Serge, mais aussi s'il y a besoin d'avoir des tranches, donc à first loss, on peut aussi, à travers le groupe de coordination arabe, mettre à disposition ces ressources nécessaires. Ce qui permettra de faciliter l'arrivée d'autres investisseurs, comme les fonds souverains, qui regardent plutôt une rentabilité financière.
Bon, très bien, merci. C'est l'effet de levier que vous recherchez. Serge Eboué, vous avez évoqué tout à l'heure le rôle de la BOAD dans la mobilisation à la fois de fonds publics et à la fois de fonds privés. Parmi les activités de la BOAD, vous supportez également les institutions financières africaines pour qu'elles deviennent également entités accréditées du GCF pour pouvoir faire un effet de levier sur les fonds multilatéraux et notamment sur le fonds vert climat. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous en parler, s'il vous plaît ?
Les fonds verts climat, nous sommes accrédités auprès de 3 fonds. En fait, leur sujet, c'est la question sont très concentrés sur les sujets d'adaptation. Mais ce qui est important là aussi, vous voyez bien dans le cadre de cette mobilisation de ressources, je rappelle que le sujet, c'est d'abord de trouver des ressources concessionnelles, donc des ressources les moins coûteuses possibles, avec les maturités les plus longues possibles. C'est ça l'idée. Mais la réalité, c'est que si vous souhaitez réaliser ces opérations, vous devez détenir, pour pouvoir jouer sur l'effet de levier, vous devez détenir le maximum de capital possible. C'est cela Et vous savez que c'est un de mes motifs préférés, c'est un des sujets sur lesquels je m'exprime beaucoup, parce que je considère que le continent est sous-capitalisé, les entreprises sont sous-capitalisées, le secteur privé est sous-capitalisé, et encore plus quand il s'agit de financer des projets d'adaptation. Voyez-vous? Donc, aujourd'hui, ce sur quoi nous travaillons beaucoup, c'est sur la question du capital. Et quand on travaille avec les fonds, ce qui est intéressant pour nous, c'est toujours pareil, c'est que sur un projet, et je reviens sur la question de la qualité de l'actif, sur un projet, ce qui est important, c'est en cas de perte, notamment des premières pertes, qui est-ce qui les porte? Voilà, qui porte les premières pertes? Exactement. Donc la tranche first lot, c'est la plus importante. Plus cette tranche sera élevée, plus vous pourrez disposer de ressources concessionnelles. Alors après, je ne sais plus, je crois que c'est vous qui aviez mentionné la question ou c'est la modératrice, je crois, la question des tranches mezzanines et des tranches seniors. Alors l'idée, c'est bien évidemment de jouer sur ça, avec avoir la tranche equity la plus élevée possible, ensuite pouvoir avoir une tranche mezzanine, et bien évidemment aller chercher les investisseurs sur les tranches seniors. Ce modèle, il marche. Il marche, y compris sur des projets dont la rentabilité financière, non pas économique, la rentabilité financière n'est pas très élevée. Donc la mobilisation des fonds climat participe, alors ça participe de ce mouvement, c'est un créneau supplémentaire de mobilisation des ressources.
C'est très clair. So increasing the level of assets help to, of course, to increase the leverage effect on debt, and this is what we are looking for. Sergio, we mentioned several times, the, let's say, concessional loans and the access, let's say, to low-cost money. And we know that the last, let's say, decade, interest rates were very, very low, and it was, let's say, exceptional. What we know now, it means things are changing very fast, and we know that interest rates are getting up and up, so meaning cheap money will not exist anymore, probably in the near future. So what IFC is doing to, let's say, to support the access to concessional loans or to issue green bonds for the private sector. We know that since 2013, 1.9 trillion, trillion was raised, to by private sector, let's say, to finance the green transition. So, what are you doing about that? What are you thinking about that?
So, thank you, Patrice. And first, IFC has been very engaged in developing green bonds in Africa. We've issued some of the first ones, and I know this is not the topic of this panel, but we also issued the first gender bond, which I think is very proud of. So we can do gender and green. I think that's even better.
It could be related.
Exactly. But coming back to the finance of green bonds, so I think this is a tapping the capital markets and helping develop the capital markets in Africa will generate more resources that can then go for climate change. But at the end, I would also say that, it's yes, the pricing of if interest rates go up, we need to figure out how does we manage to find the resource to funding. But what I think we've heard from some of the different panelists also before, yes, the amount of funds coming to Africa is very small. But is it because there's no funds available? Or is it because there's no projects available, right? And on the IFC side, we've been focusing a lot on that side, on how do you create bankable projects? How do you create projects that are bankable with maybe an element of blended finance or an element of subsidy in them? And in particular, when it comes to climate, this is one of the areas where we've put our teams to roll up their sleeves and go into some of the most difficult markets in Africa and try and find solutions. We've looked, for instance, in the Sahel. I think about 90% of 90% of agriculture in the Sahel is just rain-fed. So there's no irrigation systems. And that, with the climate change, you have issues around soil erosion, you have issues around fertility of the soils. So what we've done is we put a team to work on trying to find what we call smart agriculture solution and try and find what can be done to adapt to this climate change. So how can you finance projects that are helping improve the fight against soil erosion. And so we've developed one project, and we developed one in the north of Côte d'Ivoire, by the way, and so I'm glad to mention it since we are in Abidjan, where we found the right partner to develop the right technology to help on the irrigation side, so that you can then improve the quality of the soil. I think these are the type of projects that we need to do, that need to be replicable. So we need to think about scale, but we also need, as a development institution, and I know that many of the other panelists do the same, we're all putting our resources not just in financing projects that exist, but in trying to create these new projects, creating these new opportunities. This is at the heart of our strategy in IFC, and this is what we've been doing. And I think this is what's generating the pipeline of projects that then can be funded.
No, and now I can hear the engineer behind the banker, you know, but
it's reverse engineering, is what you're saying. But
exactly. No, but it's true. You know, it's. I mean, I remember it was maybe 20 years ago. You know, it was during the UK EU presidency. There was a room with more or less 1,000 people in a room. Part 50% were private equity guys. The other side, on the other side, we had project holders. And it was always the same debate. Do we have a lack of funding, or do we have a lack of good project? And it was always chicken and eggs, as we know, you know. So the question now is how we can help project developers, you know, to make good project, or let's say high value project, high impact project. This is a question for you, Amalia.
Thank you for that. So I think it's really, we need both. We need both a pipeline of good projects, but we also need access to capital. And I tell you why. So if you have, so for example, we have several good projects, you know, but we don't have enough capital to do all of them, which is why partnerships, as one of the key points she raised in her slide, is very important. So we have partnerships with several institutions. We have the Africa Investment Forum, which allows development finance institutions and big investors, or investors generally in Africa, to work together to look at projects, you know, all a way of getting more access to funds. We have bilateral relationships, you know, with European DFIs. We are members of, you know, the International Development Finance Club. We have Badia as a shareholder in AFC and as a partner that we look at projects. So that collaboration is very key, you know, in trying to see how we can increase the pool of capital. Likewise with Badia and also with Boade. We all have this partnership. So it's very important that we continue to find ways to strengthen this partnership and alliance to attract more capital. Now, in relation to the projects themselves, you know, we also need collaboration amongst ourselves to do more. So we have facilities, and we've been doing that for the last 15 years, and we can do more. But there are some structural issues that I want to address, and I think forums like this are good to address them. I talk about insurance and insurance premium. Insurance is the key de-risking tool for projects. It is too high for Africa, especially because the amount of claims that have been paid are minimal. You know, so that there needs to be proportionality. We all know everywhere that the less claims you have, the lower the premium. But that's not the case in Africa. That needs to be looked at. The second point is we have a lot of programs for aid and grants to Africa. But that's not what Africa needs. Africa needs investment. Yeah. So we need to be able to repurpose those aid flows and those grants to insurance. I think they'll be more useful for us if those aid flows, those grants flows are repurposed to insurance for investors within those jurisdictions to look at opportunities in Africa. I think that would be very useful. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I mean, now we are picking up very good ideas. We can try to consolidate for the organizer and maybe to communicate later. You mentioned earlier, Patrick, that at the COP, I mean, every year, you know, we have a lot of, you know, countries, you know, voicing that they will put new billion on the table, let's say, but we know as well, you know, that if I just take an example, you know, at the COP, the Brit announced, you know, I don't know, I think it was 100 million, not 1 billion, to support forests, you know, and nature-based solutions, you know. As far as I understand, there is no one single euro or pound or dollar that has already flied, let's say, to Africa, to those nature-based solutions. How we can accelerate, how we can, let's say, make sure that this money will really fly to countries, you know? Because having public money is just announce public money. It's really to have public money going to the country, supporting project.
Yeah, I think it's a valid question, Patrice. I mean, first of all, I mean, commitments made at international fora and need to be lived up to, right? I mean, we cannot just say, well, they have been said and stated by country X, Y, Z, we don't take them seriously. Otherwise, well, let's just close down that whole business model. So first of all, they have promised to double adaptation finance. I was at a global champions meeting of Ministers of Development Cooperation recently, where they said, yes, we have committed to adaptation finance doubling by 2025, but at the same time, we have now a Ukraine crisis, so hence the resources are now being diverted to another part of the world. Is that appropriate? No, it is not. I mean, if the world can mobilize the trillions of dollars for the COVID recovery, basically within the G20, I think Africa is, in essence, the forgotten continent, also from the global north. I think that is profoundly unfair. And I think the global north, including, let's say, countries like such as mine, the Netherlands, should be called upon that, one. Secondly, will that deliver enough? As we already, I think there is consensus, and that even if they come through, it's not enough. So I think three things on top of what has been said need to be put on the table. Sergio, you put on the table this idea of green bonds and even a gender bond. What Ivory Coast, you referenced that as well, is going to do is issue an adaptation bond, right? Bring into the market a 2 billion euro adaptation bond. Foundational question, what is an adaptation bond, right? To codify adaptation and just have a new asset class, that needs to be, that's the type of work which we do to support, in this case, Ivory Coast, to come up with a construct of an adaptation bond and have additional finance coming into it. Other types of instruments, debt for climate swaps. I mean, is that really utilized sufficiently enough here on the continent? I don't think so. I think there are instruments in the making which are utilized in different parts of the world which are not applied sufficiently here. But then in terms of using existing instruments, I mean, all of the colleagues here on stage have, and in the audience, have lots of experience with PPPs. I mean, that's not a new model, in infrastructure in particular. But mainstreaming climate risk into PPPs, that is new. You need to bring the best climate science and operational evidence on the adaptation space into existing instruments. I think that's where the key is. It's not one or the other, it's this whole suite of sort of solutions which need to be put on the table. As you said, Patrice, what do we need? We need scale and we need speed.
Yeah, absolutely correct. So how can we bring, let's say, insurance company in the game, you know? Because we know that insurance company are paying a big bill, you know, when you have a storm or whatever that is destroying a full city. But if we invest, you know, in resilient cities, in resilient infrastructure, of course the cost could be higher. We can have a premium, but at the end, the cost of this premium will be nothing compared to the damage that will be generated. Exactly what you said, Patrick. So how we can mobilize, let's say, you know, all these very big insurance company with a lot of, let's say, cash, you know, that is available and could be invested, you know, in this domain. Francesca, please.
Well, I don't know exactly what insurance companies prevents them from investing, but I think one reason is, well, as Sergio said, bankable projects and bankable investments. I'm not talking about projects, but companies investing and then receiving or having a structure and receiving bank financing. This would then automatically enable insurance companies to look into it. But we should also not forget the public sector role in this discussion. I mean, we are talking a lot about financing and private sector, and yes, in my view, it's really key. However, why are there not sufficient investments? Why is it so difficult for private sector to grow? It's because the investment environment is also maybe not encouraging, not speeding up. And if we talk about agri, so there's so many things to do, starting with land ownership and land reforms and registered, etc., establishing land registers, etc., so that also good companies with good intentions have a chance to grow and to invest. So let's not only talk in the public sector or in the governments about financing and funds, let's also talk about business environment, regulations, and good governance on the public side.
I agree. I mean, you want to say something? Yeah, of course.
Point that you're making about the insurance, I think one of the, and I would link what Samara was saying with what Patrick was saying earlier, what would make insurance premiums go down would be access to data, have more data. Because if I am an insurer and I look at a project in Africa, if I don't have the data, I will assume that the risk is higher than what it is. Exactly. And that's what creates a discrepancy. And so the more we can have in terms of getting more data to lower insurance premia, then I think this will have very positive impact in Africa. And I think it's if I can add to this, then we can use all the disruptive technologies and all the data that we can gather through a lot of different systems. I mean, we've seen that in agriculture, for instance, you can have systems a bit inspired with what financial institutions are doing when they do mobile lending. They have all these algorithms that calculate the risks of the borrowers based on a lot of data that they get. You can do the same thing on the agricultural side and do a mapping of the piece of land and look at how the different impacts of climate change on those lands. And then you end up having a much more granular information on the risk that you're taking if you're a lender or an investor or an insurer coming into this part of the country, this part of the... so using data and using the disruptive technologies could lower the price of insurance.
Thank you so much, Sergio. For the second point, I'm very proud to tell you that this is exactly what we are developing with the GCF fund in 23 countries. You know, it's pretty new, let's say, program called AAI, you know, meaning Agriculture Africa Initiative. And let's see what will come out, you know, but the very starting point is to analyze the risk, to measure the risk, and to mitigate the risk with, let's say, technologies, you know, that can help, let's say, to manage this risk, you know. Say, gentlemen. Yeah,
oui, c'est juste la question de l'assurance. Donc, je voudrais juste attirer l'attention qu'il y a déjà l'Africa Risk Capacity, qui est une institution africaine, qui est exactement dans le métier du risque climatique. Donc, du transfert du risque vers des assureurs internationaux. Bien sûr, la question des primes, comme l'a dit Sergio, et surtout, il y a une absence de données fiables sur les risques à encourir, mais aussi, elle est liée à une certaine perception du continent africain qui mérite d'être changée grâce aux médias, parce que, quand même, n'oublions pas que souvent, les médias dramatise tout ce qui se passe en Afrique. Et donc, nous avons besoin d'un narratif différent sur l'Afrique. Et je pense que ce narratif est en train de prendre forme, est en train de changer. Mais si les primes d'assurance demeurent assez élevées, c'est surtout par rapport au manque de données, mais aussi à la perception qui est véhiculée souvent malheureusement par les médias et parfois par la société civile. Pour d'autres raisons. Mais je pense que ce qui est important aujourd'hui, c'est que ce modèle qui utilise des technologies très avancées, donc avec des photos satellites, qui sont l'analyse des images, qui a permis pendant les 10 dernières années quand même d'indemniser beaucoup de pays africains. Déjà 100 millions d'Africains ont bénéficié donc des primes d'assurance versées dans le cadre de Africa Risk Capacity. Nous sommes actuellement au niveau de la BAD en train de travailler avec l'Africa Risk Capacity Group et d'autres partenaires pour ce qu'on appelle ARAF, qui est un peu l'acronyme de l'Africa Risk and Adaptation Fund. Et donc, je pense que ce type de financement va aussi contribuer à attirer davantage de ressources pour financer l'adaptation en Afrique.
Il faut peut-être l'upscaler et le généraliser. Maybe one question. I think there is a consensus here around the table to have a very strong, reliable, consistent database, let's say, to make more reliable, let's say, this African market. How can we finance, you know, this database? Because we are not talking about trillion or million, you know, we are talking about hundreds of, you know, maybe $1 million, you know, it's nothing compared to the challenge. How can we finance? We have the GCF money, we have all these multilateral funds, you know, that are ready. I mean, maybe a private sector could be happy to co-finance, you know, this database. What would be the solution to finance this database?
If there's one thing I got from this Africa CEO Forum is the importance of climate data and just general data to help shape this perception risk. So I will be very keen to invest in that. And I would like to, if there's anybody that is doing that, I would be glad to talk to them to see how we can. I mean, this has been on my head for so long. It just so clear today that really the issue is data. You just need to have the data to support the arguments, and then we can take it from there. So I will be keen to support and finance a project like that.
Emilia,
tomorrow, actually.
I take your words. Guys, I can tell you something. Now you are assisting to something unique. This panel, will bring together, start to make, project to constitute, this database. This is a commitment we can maybe take together today. So. Yeah.
Justement, la question des données est une question extrêmement importante. La question des statistiques, l'outil statistique dans nos pays est assez faible. Mais le problème ne vient pas uniquement d'un problème de disponibilité de l'information, mais il y a aussi un problème de ressources humaines pour avoir des statisticiens économistes, pour avoir formés des techniciens. Donc ça, c'est un grand problème. Donc ce n'est pas uniquement un problème qui est au niveau des institutions de financement et de développement, mais aussi un problème au niveau de la réforme de l'éducation dans nos pays. Et donc je pense que c'est une question qui est extrêmement importante. Je pense que la Commission économique pour l'Afrique, la CEA, peut jouer un rôle important. Et nous, banques de développement, nous sommes prêts à mettre des ressources qu'il faut, aussi bien sous forme de dons que de prêts concessionnels, pour l'accompagner. Mais je pense qu'au niveau continental, c'est le mandat de la Commission économique pour l'Afrique. Et je sais que Mme Vera est en train de travailler sur cette question, et nous sommes tous là pour l'aider.
Now we see the complexity, of adaptation. We started, by, let's say, pure adaptation in climate, and now we are talking about education to support, to tackle this issue. First, maybe you wanted to comment, I think.
No? I just wanted to say that I cannot agree more with what the consensus is truly there.
Thank you. Francesca, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, very quickly. I think data is increasingly available, and because there are many actors and collecting data, and like DFIs, we are doing our assessments, so data is on a case-by-case and project-by-project basis available. That it needs to, or we need to create a consensus which data needs to be collected and which platforms we use. Then it doesn't have to be very costly. We can use decentralized data collection and feed it into centralized platforms, and then automatically feed a system, like Google Maps, for example.
Yeah. So no doubt you will be part of the team, Francesca, to build this tool. So I think we are very close to the end, and I committed myself, let's say, to respect the timing. We have 3 minutes. So I would like from all of you, or each of you, a last word. If we would have one single sentence, let's say, to keep in mind about the conclusion of this debate. So can you start? Take my mic.
Non, c'est pour dire que effectivement, il y a cette prise de conscience très claire sur la question du financement des projets d'adaptation. Mais le point qui est important, c'est de considérer qu'on a beaucoup parlé de la qualité de l'actif, bankable, mais bankable pour moi peut donner le sentiment qu'il y a du bon et du pas bon. Oui, voilà. Je pense que la qualité de l'actif, c'est ça qui est important, avec la question de l'impact. Ce que je veux dire, c'est que il y a les moyens techniques qui existent d'aller mobiliser des ressources, puisque c'est ça le nerf de la guerre. Et à la fin de la journée, je pense que, alors, il y a le sujet de la coopération, certes, mais il y a également le sujet de la technique. C'est-à-dire que vous prenez un sujet, si vous additionnez le bilan de toutes les banques, ça ne suffira pas à financer les gaps de développement. Ça, c'est très clair. Donc, on va devoir jouer sur l'effet de levier et on va devoir jouer sur la capacité, notamment pour le bilan des banques et des banques de développement, à assurer et à titriser. Vous voyez? Et c'est ça le sujet. Donc, mon point, c'est de dire qu'on peut travailler sur le passif des banques. Et le passif des banques aujourd'hui, on a les techniques, Sidi sait ça très bien, on a les techniques de mobilisation, on sait faire. Le marché est là. Je pense que nous devons aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, nous concentrer sur la qualité de l'actif. C'est cela mon point final. Merci.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Docteur, un petit mot.
Je pense que, comme l'a dit Serge, donc, nous savons ce que nous voulons, nous pouvons le faire, mais on a besoin de travailler ensemble. Je pense que le mot-clé, comme l'a dit Soumaïla tout à l'heure, c'est le partenariat. Aucune institution seule, aucun État seul ne peut régler tous les problèmes. Mais quand on se met ensemble, quand on donc mutualise nos ressources, on partage nos connaissances, je pense que nous serons capables donc d'avancer sur le chemin de régler certains problèmes comme le problème de l'adaptation.
Merci, Docteur. Patrick, you said something. You said we need to turn, adaptation as an asset class as we did for carbon. Now carbon is starting to be really an asset class. What would be your thinking?
Well, my departing thought is, perhaps for a follow-up panel, is the third topic which you introduced, Patrice, which we hardly discussed, is using and harnessing the power of nature, right? Whether it's sort of investing in agroforestry or watershed protection or investing in let's say, in mangroves for coastal protection. I think it would be foolish not to use and harness the power of nature. Why? Because, it's good for the economy, it's good for the planet, it's good for our health. I think that is something which is completely underutilized in, let's say, not only in debates, but also in business models. And that's why we're very sort of aggressively pushing that particular business model as such.
So very good. I'm creating an investment fund for nature-based solution. I will ask you to join. Francesca.
Okay, short sentence. I repeat myself. So investing in climate adaptation is de-risking, and we need to act immediately and have a long-term view.
Very clear statement. Sergio.
Just also briefly, a lot has been already said. I just want to remind that the World Bank Group has actually approved a new climate change action plan last year, which has clearly set very ambitious targets. As many have said, this is something that we will not do alone, we'll do with all these partnerships. And at the IFC, we are very committed and we will continue pushing for this agenda. And a lot of this can be done by just unleashing the private sector. Just if you create the right business environment and if you help with some de-risking instruments, you will see that private sector will step up and will do a lot and will help on this adaptation agenda. So,
thank you, Sergio. Emilia, last word. You will be the last one to talk, so everybody listen to you.
So, again, a lot has been said. I think for us, we need adaptation, to be more mainstreamed because it is essential to rebuild. And we think Africa needs to rebuild because our infrastructure is not meant to withstand the impacts of climate change. And we are the most impacted. So it's important that we rebuild, and adaptation is key to that. Likewise, it's very important for us to localize manufacturing of all the minerals and metals that are required for energy transition in Africa, because it will save the emissions from ocean-going vessels. And we think that we need financial innovation to be able to attract flows of capital. And I'm very pleased with the light bulb that lit in my head today on the importance of data.
Oh, thank you, Emilia. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to have very big hands for the panel. They did a great job, very lively. They put the gut on the table, and we have some project now to move forward, to support for the forthcoming weeks and months. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much.